Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and I have Larry Reed on with me again. He is the president emeritus of FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, and he's the author and editor of several books, including Real Heroes and Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism. He's also the author of Was Jesus a Socialist? Why this question is being asked again, and why the answer is almost always wrong. Larry, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Doug, thank you. I really appreciate your having me again.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to have you on always, and thank you for your contributions to the message of liberty, and in more particular here, the message of liberty or the anti-message of socialism as it pertains to Jesus Christ. You've written a book recently, Was Jesus a Socialist? And as I mentioned in the subtitle, it's like this question is being asked again. And I kind of have to wonder, are you getting tired of having to address this question? Or is this why the book was here? It's like, here, I wrote a book. I don't want to keep talking about this.
Well, my guess is I'll be talking about it till my dying day because it just keeps coming back up again. But at least now I'm able to hand somebody a book and say, here, I've dealt with that. Read it. And then if you have any remaining questions, let's talk.
Yeah. Now, this book used to be a pamphlet, Render Unto Caesar, and this kind of became either a follow-up or a more expansive version. Is that right?
That's right. The earlier essay was much shorter. It came out in 2015. This is a very significant expansion of that. A lot of material that I didn't have in the initial essay.
Yeah, I'm looking at it here. It's about 130 or so pages. So it's not super lengthy. So your socialist friends might actually read it. Because it's not this 300-page treatise or whatever, but it's very to the point. It also really gets to some of the heart of the main questions that people who promote socialism would say. I mean, Jesus is used to defend just about every view a human wants Jesus to defend. I mean, I think we can kind of acknowledge that, even libertarians would say, well, Jesus was a libertarian, to which I say, no, but he's glad we are.
Yeah.
He would like us to be, in our context, libertarians. At least that's my view, of course. But it would be kind of weird to say Jesus was a libertarian. But people also use the idea that Jesus was a socialist because, well, Jesus promoted things like taking care of the poor. And so he's inspiring to a lot of people who are anti-capitalists. Where do you think that comes from? Because a lot of people look at Jesus's teachings and they're like, well, see, look, it looks like Jesus would support what I have in mind here.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes, Doug, from people not fully understanding or appreciating what socialism is and what it rests upon. There are so many people coming out of high school and college these days who, because of what their teachers told them, they think that socialism is nothing more than helping people, sharing things, giving things to people in need, free stuff. And a lot of that is it's just so superficial. I mean, there's a lot more sharing and caring and giving, philanthropy and so forth under capitalism than there ever is under socialism. What distinguishes socialism is, of course, it rests upon the use of force. It's the concentration of political power. So you really just have to dig deeper beyond those superficial bumper stickers to discover and appreciate what socialism really is. And then you see how false it is to claim that Jesus's command that we help those around us is not that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like most people want socialism to be not particularly a system, although I know some people do. But, the street view of it is like, oh, well, socialism is sort of a philosophy of, all those good things that you just mentioned that you and I would both agree with, other than the free things. We'd say, oh, well, we need to be nice and we need to share and we need to give and be compassionate and all these other things. And it's like, well, yeah, who's going to be against that? But when you institutionalize it and make it a system from the government, it becomes, that's actually what historically socialism is. And obviously the trick in communicating with people about what socialism is that they're saying, oh, well, that's not what I mean. I don't mean gulags. I don't mean outright communism, although I've heard some theological defenses of it. So how do you begin to discuss with people what socialism is when it seems so hard to define? Because, they're kind of like, well, that's not what I mean by it. I mean these principles.
Yeah, they do that all the time. In fact, socialists don't even agree among themselves as to what socialism is. There was a time in history, not all that long ago, 100 years or so ago, when it was widely thought that socialism was government ownership of the means of production. But then when that was actually tried in places like the old Soviet Union and proven to be such a disastrous flop over and over again, a lot of socialists said, well, that's not what we mean. Let's try it a different way. What we mean is kind of just central planning of an economy.
Yeah.
And there are other socialists say, well, no, what we mean is a welfare state. So there are different variants of it, but it always comes down to the use of force and concentrated power in the hands of the state. Under capitalism, or freedom and free markets, if you want to practice, as some people have tried, the variety of socialism where you just share and share alike, put your earnings in a common storehouse and distribute it equally. There have been attempts to do that, like the Robert Owen communities of 150 years ago. You're free to do that. Just go ahead and you do it now. You don't have to wait for the government to impose it on anybody. Just go out to talk to your neighbors and agree with them to divide up your earnings and redistribute it equally. But not even socialists attempt to do that, even though they advocate it if the government could impose it.
Seems to this might be a little bit too much of an aside issue, but I just want to point out the irony in young people today who really want to be sort of like, don't tell me who I am, let me define myself, let me be, don't tell me what to do, are also, and again, I don't want to overgeneralize here for young people per se, but people coming out of college and so forth. It also seems like those views are like, well, but at the same time, when we vote, we need to tell everybody else what to do.
Yeah, it's a failure to put two and two together, a failure to see the logical implications of the things you've been advocating, failure to see the inconsistencies in your thinking. Yeah. And I think that's a testimony to the fact that in so many places these days, we are not teaching things like critical thinking skills, logic, let alone history and deep philosophy. It's just so superficial. Much of it's just a lot of bumper stickers and virtue signaling rhetoric.
Yeah. So early on in your book, you talk about three parables that help us, think through, you evaluate them and you help us think through what it is that Jesus is teaching. You want to go over at least one of those?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There are, I think, nearly 40, as I recall, parables that Jesus tells, and most have little or no direct economic content. They deal with salvation or eschatology, personal character, and other things. But there are three that have substantial economic content, and every single one of them ends up with a message that is strongly supportive of freedom, free markets, private property, personal choice, and people exhibiting their character from their heart, not by how they vote. One of them is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm amazed at how many people think that parable somehow makes a case for a welfare state. But it does you've heard it too. It's crazy. But, consider the context of the story. You have a Samaritan who's on his way to his destination, and he comes upon a man along the road who's been beaten and robbed. And what does he do? Does he say to the man in need, well, you should contact your social worker, or maybe there's a government program for you, or I'll see if I can find a politician who can help you out? No. What he does is, and this is essentially what makes him a good Samaritan, he, of his own free will, chooses to help the man and does it with his own resources. Now, how anybody can twist that into a case for the compulsory and politicized redistribution of wealth through government is beyond me.
Well, and not only that, even to take it one step further, and again, this is a little bit of an argument from silence, but he does it out of his own resources. He doesn't go on GoFundMe and do it I mean, he doesn't even do it in a group method non-violently.
Yeah.
Like you're making the point. He does. Yeah, it's very personal. And of course, the story, could have been, talked about in such a way that his community raises the money and goes and helps him. That story could have been told and it wasn't. So I don't want to make too much big a deal out of that one. What about the parable that...
I might say if he was a hardcore Marxist, that brand of socialist, he might have said, "I'll be right back. I'm going to go rob a few rich people's homes and gather the loot and bring it here for you." I mean,
I'm gonna go steal from your employer who made you work so hard you couldn't make it along the path yourself.
You're right.
What about the parable of the talents?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites because at the end of it, Jesus has the man at the center of the parable saying nothing like what a socialist would say in a similar situation. A man is leaving his estate for a period of time, and he trusts three men with portions of his wealth. That initial distribution, by the way, is not equal for those egalitarians who might be listening. And then he comes back later and he says, "Okay, I want to find out what you each did with it." And he asks the first man, "What'd you do?" And of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but the first man says, "Well, you'll be happy with me. I buried it in the backyard, so I have just as much as you entrusted me with." But Jesus has the estate owner actually upbraiding the man, basically saying, "What? You didn't do anything with it? That's terrible." And then he goes to the second guy and he says, "What'd you do with what I entrusted you with?" And he says, "Oh, you'll be happy with me. I doubled or tripled the value. I made some great investments. I put it to work. I've magnified the wealth." And he's praised. And then the third guy says, essentially, "Those two guys are pikers. I did it even better than the second guy. I've magnified it by a factor of 6 or 7 or whatever." He's the one that the owner of the estate praises the greatest. And then Jesus has him taking the money from the first guy and giving it to the third guy because he knows how to magnify wealth.
This is probably a good time to talk about the rich themselves. I mean, right now, we are recording mid-2020, and the coronavirus pandemic has apparently, according to many headlines, and I would even be okay taking it at face value, that the wealthy, the ultra-wealthy, are actually faring much better than the average person during this crisis, partly because of government action, not necessarily because of free market action. But regardless of whether or not that's actually the case, it does seem to me that the wealthy are demonized and become villains way too quickly, especially pretty decent, hardworking, non-rent-seeking business owners.
Exactly right. And that's probably been the case in most societies throughout most of history. There's something about human nature that has within it a very strong motivation to envy. And that's very unfortunate. It's something that Jesus himself warns against on multiple occasions. In fact, he points out that he came to uphold the law, the Mosaic law, the 10 Commandments in particular. And we all know that the 10th commandment says, "Thou shalt not covet." In other words, don't count the other guy's blessings, count your own. Now, because Jesus was also an advocate of things like honesty and fair dealing, he would not support anybody using political connections to get special favors at other people's expense. That kind of cronyism is essentially dishonest, and Jesus advocated honesty at all times. But that's a small portion of all the people in the country you could classify as capitalist or entrepreneurial. People who've started a business, they're creating wealth, they're employing people, taking risks. They are the lifeblood of any prosperous economy. I mean, if nobody did that, if we all just sat back and expected goods to come our way without thinking about how and who would create them, I think we'd be in terrible shape. So, yeah, the rich are often singled out, but it makes some people feel good to attack them. Maybe in part because in a lot of cases, they don't know how to become rich themselves. And to them, it's becoming wealthy means you've got to work, you've got to invest, you've got to take risks, things that maybe they don't want to do.
Yeah. Or, I mean, maybe that's not something that's in their wheelhouse per se, or maybe that's not even their desire, but to sort of translate that into, well, I'm going to demonize them and stuff. That's kind of a completely different angle on it. But Jesus did seem to have a lot of warnings and
Yes.
admonitions for those who had wealth. So it's not without some merit that we discuss what does Jesus even say about the wealthy? You and I can sit here and
Yeah.
lament economically why the wealthy shouldn't be necessarily demonized. What did Jesus have to say?
Well, certainly there's no occasion, and it would be incompatible with everything else he said, where Jesus said that whether or not you can be saved, whether or not you get to heaven will depend upon how much money you have. He was far more interested in what's in your heart. He does warn on multiple occasions that wealth often brings temptation. I think he would say the same about power, which is what socialists are all about and what they're trying to accumulate. But he warns that with wealth come temptations that if your character is not solid, you might allow those temptations to take over your life. You might even end up worshiping wealth. And I always say, look, the best capitalist isn't one who worships wealth. Why would you want to do that? You don't want your wealth to run you. You want to run your wealth. That's part of the secret to good entrepreneurship. So Jesus is saying, just be wary. And all you have to do is take a look on any given day in the news from places like Hollywood or athletics, almost any walk of life, and you find that there are considerable numbers of people who, when confronted with sudden or great wealth, can't handle it. Then you really discover that they didn't have solid character, and now they begin worshiping that wealth. They allow it to corrupt them. That's what Jesus is warning against. But he'd be ecstatic about someone who kept the commandments, was faithful to God, a solid Christian, accepted Jesus as his Savior, and was a magnifier of wealth by producing things that other people want and need.
Yeah. You mentioned the gospel of envy. That word is, I don't think you coined that phrase. I think that's a quote from somebody, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who said that first. A lot of people have. I'm not sure who may have used it first.
Yeah. What's the concept there? Because, I mean, we translate that to the good news of envy, and I don't know if any person even unwittingly realizing or unwittingly promoting such a thing would say that there's any good news about envy. So what is meant by that phrase?
By the way, I think I just remembered Winston Churchill, at least, is famous for his reference to the so-called gospel of envy, although I don't know that he was the first to use it. So by the gospel of envy, this is a way of thinking that says, if somebody else is better off than me, well, then by definition, I'm a victim, and he's the victimizer, and that the remedy in this situation is to punish that person by taking something from him, irrespective of how he came into the possession of it. Most socialists don't make a difference between a business person who has come upon great wealth because of his political connections and the many others who simply are being rewarded in the marketplace voluntarily by very happy customers. There is a huge difference there. But if you envy another person, and that leads you into invariably very negative behaviors. It causes you to focus not on improvement of yourself, but rather tearing the other guy down. It causes you to want to embrace political solutions to so-called problems instead of voluntary, persuasive change that is peaceful. Envy, I don't know of any case in world history where people who became envious were in any way uplifted. It's a sinister motive that leads to evil, I think, because it's evil in its very essence right from the start.
Yeah. When I was in Bible college, I was taught the Baptist theology of separation of church and state, and one of the verses that the professor took us to was the passage which you deal with, and for a different context, render unto Caesar. And the idea is that there are things that are God's that we deal with, spiritual things, and then there are political things. That's not quite what it means. What's your take on that?
Yeah, by the way, I think, if I'm not incorrect, I think you helped me with this particular passage. I quoted you in the book, I think, in this context. So thank you for your assistance. I know
You're
that
welcome.
some socialists look at that statement from Jesus, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and to God that which is God's. And they seem to think that it's some kind of blanket endorsement by Jesus for just about anything that Caesar claims is his, no matter how he proposes to get it or what he does with the money once he takes it. I mean, that's absurd. How out of context would that interpretation be, given what we know of all the other things that Jesus had to say? This was a very clever response on the part of Jesus to a group of Pharisees who were trying to trick him. They wanted to get him to say something that they could run to the Roman authorities with and say, aha, it sounds like he's promoting tax evasion. So if you look at it in that context, you realize that, wow, could there be a more clever and incisive response than this one? Render unto Caesar that which is his. He doesn't say it is his. He certainly doesn't say everything is Caesar's or anything he claims may be his. He leaves it to us to decide whether or not it really does belong to Caesar. And one of those options is it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe nothing does. But he doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of what government should do, how big it should be. That's up to us.
It's kind of a passage that you don't want to use to defend that sort of split view. Do you know who Jim Wallace is?
I don't think so.
He founded Sojourners, which is a sort of progressive left Christian organization from the 70s, I believe they started.
Oh, it rings a distant bell.
So he actually did a debate against Greg Boyd, he's not a libertarian, but he's way more on our side of things with respect to the Christian's relationship to the state. He did a debate with Greg Boyd, and somebody asked Jim what the meaning of render unto Caesar was, and he went through this explanation that basically Jesus was trying to make the point that nothing belongs to Caesar. And I remember thinking, oh wow, that's like really good, because that Jesus is making this more meta point, which is what you said. This is one of the possible answers. And Boyd was like, yeah, I don't have any follow-up to that. That's the best answer I've heard too. And they were in the middle of a debate. So that stuck with me. I mean, I probably listened to that debate probably 8 years ago or something, but it's just interesting to me that a person who has explicitly said that Jesus would call for redistribution of wealth actually has that perspective. So maybe he was using it in a different way, like, well, everything belongs to God, and therefore, taxation is not theft or something. I don't know.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But so credit where credit is due. Norman actually helped you with that chapter on render unto Caesar. But I do remember you reaching out to me, and it was the passage on wealth, on rich people.
Okay.
That's where I assisted you a little bit. So anyway, we were happy to help you. I was glad to know that you reached out to us to help you out with this project.
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah. So one of the things you say in your book is that socialism nullifies the golden rule. That's a pretty bold claim, I think. So can you spell that out for us?
Yeah, I think the golden rule implies voluntary interactions between people, as opposed to coercive, compulsory interactions. Do unto others what you would have others do unto you, which Jesus himself gives expression to in the New Testament. Well, the question then is, would you want somebody else to push you around, tell you how to run your life, take your stuff, put you out of business, tax you excessively? Probably not. So why would you want to do that to them? Socialism is a system, as we've mentioned, that rests upon force, on ugly things like envy and presumption, as if an elite at the top with political power know better how to run your life than you do. And so they end up exerting all kinds of undue pressure on people through the police power of government. And probably none of them would want others to turn it around and use it on them.
Yeah. So this brings up sort of I don't know. I don't know where to place this question in terms of categorizing it, but I'll just kind of maybe ask it. So when libertarians and politics in general in the United States tends to be, now coronavirus has helped change this a bit because governors have been, very much in the spotlight for each person wherever they are. But most of the time, politics is about national politics, not really, at least in terms of the discussion about, what would Jesus do or how would Jesus vote? Who would Jesus, vote for president, all that kind of stuff. It's very national. And I often wonder how is it socialism when you have a community of, say, 5,000, 10,000 people come together and build a park, or have, half a percentage of your income or property taxes or whatever it might be, goes to local taxes and you build a park and do fire protection and all of that kind of thing. Or are we talking about larger scale? Like, does it become more socialism as you scale up? Or how do you assess that kind of, I hope you're getting to what my question is here.
Yeah, I think so. Well, if it's voluntary, it's not socialism. If it's compulsory, even if it's imposed by majority vote, and even if it's very local, well, then it certainly has socialistic tendencies. Well, then we can ask ourselves, all right, let's for a moment accept that a community coming together to implement a public park is somewhat socialistic. Would it be any better if a more distant level of government were to do it instead of that local community? Probably not. I mean, if there's going to be a local park and compulsion to fund it and create it, I'd much prefer that be done as locally as possible because that makes that government entity more accountable. The further the government is from an activity or from the people that are directly impacted, the more likely you will have indifference, apathy, corruption, inefficiency, waste of money, and all that kind of thing. So even if we were to accept it for a moment that it's we can embrace it, even if it's socialistic, it's still better to do it at the most local level possible.
Yeah, it seems like you get more trouble the more centralized you become.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the lessons of history. And don't forget, some things may seem like, well, that's the only way that public park can get done. Well, not necessarily. Some amazing things have been done by private people, including some really massive park-like activities and ventures. Last I heard, Disneyland is not run by the government.
Yes, but not everybody can go there.
Well, I suppose, but I can't go to a park in your town either because it's about 800 miles away.
Yeah. But you could. Like, if you wanted to visit, you probably could. I think that's the argument most people would say, is that it's kind of open access, which, of course, you and I both know have economic complications to it.
Yeah, and it's true that Disneyland does charge admission, but where would be the justice in forcing grandma from Bad Axe, Michigan, to pay in taxes so that you and I can go to Disneyland in Orlando? I mean, what's wrong with a user fee?
Well, yeah, no, I agree, of course. And I think that's where, when you get to the local community level, it makes it's less offensive for sure. And it's less problematic, I should say, for someone to, go around and canvass and say, hey, we want to put up a new park, and, it's only going to cost you this much per year, so that we can all enjoy it. It's very different from saying, hey, some politician who didn't even have a chance to vote for is making sure that the politician you did have to vote for but didn't goes along with their plan. So it just gets really, the further away it gets. So I always think about, this is just me, I always think about, how do you define the word we when we say we do something? Yeah. The further and further away the decision making gets from we the people, the less and less we it is, and the more and more problematic it is. That's kind of the way I think about it.
The more you have a lot of those we's saying, wait a minute, you didn't ask me, or I'd really rather put my money to other uses than the one you forced me to do.
Yeah, for sure. So we get this question fairly frequently when people are just sort of getting into Christian libertarianism and understanding, like, well, where are good places and resources to read? And so at the end of your book, you have some Christian thinkers and theologians who got it right. And I think our listeners would really love to know, like, hey, if they want to read more, thinkers that, came before us, what could they read? Who is, I don't want to use the word safe, but who is within sort of like within arm's reach of where we stand on this issue?
Yes. Well, the two that I wrote about near the end of the book are my favorite. And not only because I think theologically they were deep thinkers and genuine men of God who sought the truth no matter what, but when it comes to matters of the proper role of government, I think they got that right too. And one of them was C.S. Lewis. Now, set alongside of the massive amount of material he wrote that is theological in nature is a pretty small portion that deals with matters of government and the role of the individual versus the state and so forth. But boy, every time he addressed that, he got it right. He understood that human beings are seriously flawed, that we have a sin nature. And the last thing you should want to do is to concentrate earthly political power in flawed human beings, because that simply gives them an opportunity to put that kernel of evil to a huge and destructive application. So he was interested in diffusing power for that very reason, because he understood human nature, and he realized that we should not be worshiping government anyway, no matter what, because it's a human flawed institution, and very quickly will push God aside and try to put itself at the center of your life. The other theologian was J. Gresham Machen, who was the founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian denomination and also of Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He lived in the early part of the 20th century. He testified in Congress in the 1920s when a proposal came forth to create a federal Department of Education. And I have quoted from that in an article or two at fee.org. And oh my gosh, I mean, he nailed it. He realized that education was not a state responsibility. And if you put the state in charge of education, here's the kind of nasty stuff that will follow. And he was a solid man of God who read Scripture for what it was intended to convey and didn't try to twist it until it confessed to things that socialists would like it to say, but which it doesn't. So both of those men are, no matter what they wrote in theology or otherwise, I think J. Gresham Machen, C.S. Lewis are great men. And I also have high praise in the book for Augustine from the 5th century A.D. I think to the extent he dealt with these earthly political matters, he tended to see the state for what it was as well and was a believer in individual liberty.
Yeah. So what's on the horizon for you? Are you working on any new projects or books that we can look forward to?
Well, I'm primarily an article writer. I think I've written 8 or 9 books, but probably 2,000 articles. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of another subject that I'd love to explore and write about. Just did an article a few days ago, you can find at fee.org, about an ancient civilization that a month ago I knew nothing about, called Khazaria, Khazaria. And the more I read, the more thrilled I was to learn about what a tolerant people they tended to be. They were magnificent traders, and they had a largely decentralized government, and they were around for about 350 years until
Where did this come across your knowledge? How did you learn about this?
Oh, that's a good question. It was so often I get an idea for writing something based upon just a casual reference in another book. Somebody just drops it in a single sentence, and I'm thinking, holy cow, there's got to be a message there. I want to look into that. I think that was the case with Khazaria, but I can't remember where that initial impulse came from.
One of these days, I'll be able to follow the threads again that I read. In my stage of life, I don't quite have that.
Well, I'm sort of semi-retired, so I have more time now to read and write. And I also have my own website, lawrencewreed.com, where people could read that article on Khazaria and other things too.
Well, great. Well, I appreciate you, Larry, all you do for, you've advised us in the past, and you just crank out really great material. So we will promote that on the show notes page, and I appreciate you joining us for the episode.
Hey, it's been my pleasure, Doug, and keep up the great work. The Libertarian Christian Institute is vitally needed. You're filling a void, and I wish you all the best.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
Hey, podcast listeners. Since you like listening to audio content, we wanted to let you know about a new audiobook titled Called to Freedom: Why You Can Be Christian and Libertarian. It's read by me, Jacqueline Isaacs, one of the contributing authors of the book, and every download helps to support the Libertarian Christian Institute. To learn more and to download the audiobook today, go to calltofreedombook.com.